So, part 3 of the Cold War. This is going to be the Cold War at home. So, we're going to talk about this as quickly as we can. So, the election of 1948. Remember, Harry Truman took over for Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he passed away unexpectedly in 1945. So, the election of 1948, basically, Harry Truman was behind. He was the underdog. He's on a campaign trip, a whistle-stop tour, and he always looked down at his speech. And about 5 seconds before he looked down to give his speech, and what he did was he read off of that speech, and if anybody said anything in the crowd, he wouldn't acknowledge it. But about 5 seconds before he looked down, somebody in the back of the crowd yelled, "Give him hell, Harry," and that was his campaign slogan for the 1948 election. That's what become his, because he said, "I'm trying to." And so Truman, he goes on this whistle-stop campaign, and he starts calling Congress to do nothing Congress because they passed the fewest laws in the early part of the 20th century. If you look at your modern-day Congresses, the past 3 or 4, they're close to it. But he called them the do nothing Congress. You had the other party here, the Dixiecrats. They fought against integration. Segregation was fine with them. 2 separate societies. South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond would be the Dixiecrat presidential nominee. Keep in mind, Strom Thurmond will serve in the Senate until I think around 2002, 2003 from South Carolina. Liberal progressives, more reform. Vice President Henry Wallace will end up being the liberal progressive presidential nominee, who was the former vice president under FDR for 3 of his terms before Truman came in the 4th term. Republican governor, New York Governor Thomas Dewey, he doesn't campaign hard, and he pretty much had to lead throughout most of this whole campaign. As a matter of fact, the newspapers wrote that Dewey defeats Truman in 1948 because all the polls showed that Dewey was going to win this election. And at the last minute, lo and behold, turns out Truman ended up winning the presidential election, and Dewey will be heavily criticized for not campaigning hard the last 2 weeks. I think the last 2 weeks of the campaign he stayed at home. So Democrats also regained control of Congress. So Truman offers the American people the Fair Deal, which is an extension of the New Deal. He wants to nationalize health care, and he wants crop subsidies for farmers to pay federal money to subsidize crops to make crops cheaper for Americans to buy. Remember, FDR is the first one to talk about a nationalized healthcare system, but Harry Truman wanted this as well. Both of these things are going to be defeated in Congress. However, minimum wage was raised from 40 to 75 cents an hour. Social Security was extended to about 10 million more people. Congress set aside money to clean up slums and rebuild houses for low-income families. We get a new Red Scare in the 1940s and 50s, late 40s, early 50s, and it comes from Joseph McCarthy, this gentleman over here in the right top corner. McCarthyism means to falsely accuse somebody of doing something without any evidence. This man, I believe he's elected to the Senate in 1946 from Wisconsin. He's a Republican, and he didn't like to do anything in government. He liked to golf and he liked to drink. And he was coming up on his campaign, and he didn't have anything he had done in 6 years in the Senate. And it kind of stumbled across him that there could be communists in our government. So he starts lying. He starts making up numbers. He starts saying we've got communists in our government, and he does this on the Senate floor where he has immunity from slander. And he won't say anything about numbers and who's in it outside of the Senate, but he does inside the Senate chamber, so he won't be sued. So this starts a national Red Scare. People are worried about communists all around. People are worried about communists in their government, and it really starts into a firestorm. And he makes the whole thing up so he could win re-election, by the way. So here's some McCarthyism cartoons. The whole thing comes to a head with McCarthy in 1954 when he puts on trial the army, the head of the army, and he bullies him. He's seen on TV to bully this the gentleman, and people start to turn away from McCarthy and say this could be all bogus, which it was. Keep in mind, Republicans did know that this was all fake and a lie, but they let it continue because they wanted to win the presidency in 1952 and they wanted to win the Congress back. So they allowed this stuff to continue. But anyway, with the new Red Scare, U.S. citizens in the 1950s are going to greatly fear communism. They felt that communists wanted to take over the world. This fear was known as the Red Scare. The second Red Scare we had, remember, the one in the 1920s. These two people over here to your left, these are convicted spies, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And of course, Alger Hiss comes before. He caused fear that our government was infiltrated by communists, and he comes in the 1940s. But these two here, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, they're going to be executed, the first spies in U.S. history to ever be executed. And what we find out in the 1990s after the Soviet Union falls is that Julius Rosenberg was probably a spy. Ethel Rosenberg knew nothing of what was going on, so we executed an innocent lady. So we have HUAC. This is the House, Un-American Activity. So the House comes up with their own, to find out if they come up with their own committee to find out if there are communists in our government. This committee was set up to investigate communist activities in the U.S. HUAC searched for Soviet spies and communist sympathizers. Basically, one of the first questions you're asked is, are you now or have you ever been a communist? So you'll see here the Hollywood 10. Basically, these were people accused of being communist. They were often blacklisted. A group of Hollywood actors who were blacklisted for refusing to answer HUAC questions became known as the Hollywood 10. If someone was blacklisted, it meant they were not able to work in our society. They were ostracized. So we have some of the greatest filmmakers, actors, and writers. The writers actually went under assumed names and continued to write movies, but they got low pay for it because nobody recognized who the name was. So your daily life changes. We're going to watch this duck and cover video. That's one of your activities. Fallout shelters are going to be built. You're going to have these duck and cover videos and these duck and cover drills you got to do in school. My parents remember doing them. Your grandparents may. So the Russians end up launching Sputnik. What is Sputnik? It is an intercontinental ballistic missile. All they did is they put a satellite on top instead of a nuclear warhead. So they beat us in this technological race here. They had the technological advantage. So it looks like we had faltered. The impact of Sputnik would be Congress establishes the National Aeronautic and Space Agency, NASA, to conduct research in rocket and space technology. Congress also passes the National Defense Education Act, which provides more money in education and training in science, math, and foreign languages. 1958, 1959 is where foreign languages in schools become mandatory. So as you see, the space race begins. The space race begins in 1961. Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin blasted off into space, making the Soviet Union the first nation to launch a man into human orbit. Kennedy replies to this by saying the U.S. would land a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. And this happens in 1961. So a lot of things are going to happen here, but Kennedy will not be with us in 1969. And on Kennedy's challenge, it's met July 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong became the first human to step foot on the moon. And here's his statement. He says, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." So the Cold War heats up. 1960, Colonel Francis Gary Powers in a spy plane is shot down over the Soviet Union in 1960. We're not supposed to be flying over Soviet airspace. Remember, Eisenhower wanted to open skies policy in 1955 and the Soviets refused. Well, we had been flying spy planes over the Soviet Union in the 1950s, in the early 50s and the late 50s. This was marked to be the last time we flew over Soviet airspace, and he's shot down. The Berlin Wall comes about. As you see, the Soviets want to keep Germans from moving out of East Germany into West Berlin, where they could be free. So this looks bad for the Soviet Union. So over a 24-hour period, they build the Berlin Wall. It came to be a symbol of communist oppression around the world, and it separates the city of Berlin. They build this wall through buildings, by the way. So President Kennedy gives a speech in 1963 in Berlin. It's called Ich bin Berliner, meaning I'm a Berliner. President Kennedy tells Berliners that the West is with them. That's a thing from Sting, one of his songs. So Castro, 1959. Here's the Cuban Dilemma. This, if you really want to kind of understand a little bit about Cuba, you know, here's some things here. Crisis over Cuba, 1961. Eisenhower cuts all diplomatic ties with Cuba, simply because Fidel Castro was a nationalist. He took power, and he was not a communist, nor was he a free enterprise guy. He was a nationalist. He wanted to take all these corporations and businesses that were down in Cuba, and he wanted to make them Cuban businesses. The Batista government was a pro-American government, and really Havana was the Vegas of the East. That's where all the rich Americans went. This is like America's playground. Meanwhile, Cubans are living in dirt poor poverty. So he basically is coming along trying to uplift the Cuban population and give them a little bit more of a fighting chance, because most of the big businesses and rich people were Americans. So he's a nationalist, kind of like America first, Cuba first for him. So in 1959, Castro takes control of government. It takes it from Batista. Our response is basically we're going to turn against Castro. Castro turns to the U.S. first for help. The U.S. imposes trade barriers on Cuba. Castro will rely more on the Soviets for help. About 10% of the population went into exile. The U.S. would feel betrayed because one dictatorship replaced by another. But really what it was is the big businesses over here in the U.S. didn't want Eisenhower to agree to give up any business in Cuba. So Eisenhower won't help Castro out. So Castro ends up turning to somebody who will help him out, and that's the Soviets. In 1961, the Bay of Pigs basically is a leftover from the Eisenhower administration. The CIA trained Cuban exiles. JFK did not want to go through with this plan, but he's pushed by former President Eisenhower and former Vice President Nixon. We know that this plan was a bad plan because Nixon admits to it in the Watergate tapes later on. And they did it they pushed it on Kennedy and wanted him to do it to embarrass him as a president. All of this comes out in 1974. So Kennedy doesn't like the plan, but he listens to people. He listens to his former adversaries in Nixon and Eisenhower. April 17th, 1961, he approves the plan. We landed the Cuban exiles on the southern coast of Cuba. It's called the Bay of Pigs. This was an embarrassment for Kennedy. This invasion attempt, this coup d'etat attempt failed miserably. And Kennedy's, of course, criticized for being too young of a president, not very good, not a very good decision maker, but he does learn from it, and it helps us with the Cuban crisis, which is coming up. So that's what we've got for this section. We'll pick up with part 4.